asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
My next guest is a true heroine. I said this earlier, and I meant it. She blew the whistle on the systematic grooming and sexual exploitation of nearly 1,500 children in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. She gave nearly more than 200 documents, restricted access documents, to the Times newspaper back in 2012. She risked everything by doing that. Going to prison, of course, was a real possibility, and the retaliation against her was breathtaking. Those files she handed over showed that police and social services had been aware of extensive evidence of sex grooming in Rotherham by groups of men of Pakistani heritage for more than a decade. Offenders had been identified, but no prosecutions followed, incredibly. The publication of her information resulted in an independent inquiry being set up, and she wrote a book about her experiences. It's a must-read. It's called Broken and Betrayed, the true story of the Rotherham abuse scandal by the woman who fought to expose it. Let's welcome Jayne Senior, MBE, to the programme. Hey Jayne, thanks for coming on. How are you?
Thank you, Richie. That were an introduction. But thank you for inviting me to come on as well.
You're welcome. I'm going to have a sit down there to get over that introduction, so you can take over and start chatting away there in the background. But of course, all of it is true, and of course, that doesn't really encompass everything that you went through. Of course, I came across you this morning again on national media, as did many of our listeners, and you told Sky News in a revealing, very good interview, that things that were promised that would happen in the wake of what you exposed haven't happened, and that the victims of the exploitation have been forgotten and have been left down. How have they been forgotten and left down?
I think for me, I was invited, I exposed this in Rotherham. I did everything that I thought I needed to do, and very naively, I went down to meet the then Prime Minister David Cameron in 2015. I went along with Sarah Champion, our MP, Alexis J, who was leading the inquiry, a victim and a parent. And we met with David Cameron and we spoke about lots of things that we believe were needed, the failures in Rotherham, and what we thought could have been done to avoid what became one of the most horrendous abuse scandals ever known. David Cameron actually spoke to us, I believe, as a father, because he shared lots of information about his own family, his own background. And I came out of there and I actually believed that something was going to happen. And following our meeting, he actually went into a summit and he actually announced that CSE was now basically a national crisis. And we sit here and it's like 3.5, nearly 4 years on from J report, 3 years, just over 3 years since I met him. And I just feel that Rotherham has been forgotten. Rotherham's not unique. We know CSE is happening all over. But here we are, we're still trying to get hold of therapy, counselling. I currently manage a charity that's working with a significant amount of those that, went through some of the most horrendous abuse as children, now young adults. Some of them on waiting lists for 18 months to actually get in front of a counsellor or to get any therapy. And I just think that's absolutely disgraceful. We asked for a national database so we could share information about perpetrators. As I said, it's not unique to Rotherham. We may have alleged perpetrators in Rotherham that could be active or linked to other areas. We know that some of these children were trafficked, so obviously the people that we believe were trafficking them and that we know were trafficking them will be crossing borders, crossing county lines, so there's lots of things. We got mandatory education for children and young people on relationships. That's fabulous. But are we actually looking at what the contents are? What are we teaching children? Is that across the board? Is that going into every school? Tell me to shut up if I keep going on.
Not at all. This is really important.
I think about one thing that we also seem to have missed is What about the parents? A lot of truth came out of Rotherham, but a lot of myths as well. And one of the things that we see over and over again is, what did parents do to protect? Where were the parents? I'm not going to disagree that some parents weren't fit to be parents, but on the whole, a lot of our parents were actively going out, doing everything they could to protect the children. So to me, we've got one father who reported and asked for help on 200 occasions, which led to him being arrested. So where are we out there educating parents on how to spot the signs, how to recognise, and actually when they ask for help, giving them the help and the support? And finally, what about our communities? Who better to spot the signs of a child in distress or being groomed or an adult that we think poses a risk? Where's education in communities? What about our nighttime economy? Where are we going and actually speaking, educating and raising awareness? These are the things that 3 years ago I walked away thinking, do you know what? This is going to be happening. We're seeing pockets of good practice, but we're not seeing a national joined up, well-funded initiative that comes from the government. We're not seeing that, and that's such a shame really, because we had an opportunity to have a blank piece of paper, do the research, listen to those that are being affected, let them tell us, what they needed as children, and let's develop the services listening to what they're telling us is needed. Does that make sense? Sorry, that were a very long answer.
No, it was it made a lot of sense. There was a number of things that came up in it as well that I was making notes as you were going along there. Some of the victims have had to wait 18 months for counselling. That's extraordinary. Was there any promise given that victims in Rotherham might be given, kind of like a fast track to help? Was that a possibility? Or is some counselling services were funded by our local authority.
But as we know, the cuts to local authorities are astronomical. What we've got is small charities trying to prop up some of this. So, we've got, at the moment, the charity I manage, we've got victims that are doing fundraising, such as charity backpacks and sponsored walks, to try to raise money to access different forms of therapy and different forms of counselling. And one of the things that I always say, we've got the National Crime Agency in Rotherham at the moment, and that's great. We're looking at the abusers, and hopefully, going forward, we're going to lock lots of them up. But for some of those victims, they won't come forward. There'll be different reasons. They'll not feel confident. They'll not want to, and we work with people that say, I don't want to come forward, Jayne. I don't want to go to court. I don't want justice. For others, they're coming forward and they're doing interviews and getting justice. But everybody deserves counselling. Whether you're coming forward or not, if you've been affected by this abuse, you need counselling. There's no counselling service that we're aware of for parents because they weren't abused. Well, actually, to sit and watch your child systematically abused, that can sometimes have gone on for 2, 3, 4 years, feeling helpless to do anything, then do you not deserve some therapy and help as a parent?
Yeah, it's a real trauma. It must be a terrible trauma.
I damn well need it if it were my child.
That's a great point, Jayne, and maybe a lot of people maybe haven't considered that. On the counselling issue, a friend of my partner and we have a friend in the city, and he's not been well, and was recommended some counselling by his NHS doctor, but he was told it could be a year before somebody is available. That investment just isn't there, which you touched on. And not to put words in your mouth, and I'm kind of apolitical. I've never supported any political party, but I'm guessing that David Cameron made promises in 2015 that he probably knew he couldn't meet. In terms of, he knew full well the austerity cuts that were coming, whether he was going to remain on as Prime Minister after the EU referendum or not. That funding cuts to local authorities and to the NHS has been absolutely devastating. And what does it mean?
Yeah, and I think that's where I woke up with my naivety, because following my meeting and others when we had with David Cameron, there was a cross-party summit. And, abuse doesn't happen. Abuse is not political. This can happen to anybody, regardless of whoever you vote for or whatever party you stand for. So it needs to be cross-party, which is why, this letter that Sarah Champion's written again to the government is a cross-party. There's MPs from the Labour, Conservative and Liberal parties that have actually signed it, because we need to be tackling this together. We can't make it a political fight. It's not politics. It's children's lives. It's children's futures. All children deserve a right to a childhood free from abuse and to an adulthood where they can go on. They're not suffering from PTSD. Some of them are not self-harming. They can go into work, college. Every child that's born deserves that kind of future.
Without exception, Jayne. I just want to remind our listeners who's on the line. Obviously, a lot of our listeners know all about you. A lot of really nice tweets coming in. Jayne Senior MBE is live on the line. Blew the whistle on probably the most notorious cases of child grooming in the history of this country, and took an enormous risk by doing that at great personal expense to her, but did it anyway. And that's, it's an overused word, hero or heroine, but she is, and I'm really glad she came on the programme.
It's those that have come forward and and are actually speaking out to give all the victims the strength to come forward, that are actually now survivors, and they deserve the title survivors because they have survived this. And for some of them, it's actually made them grow and made them stronger. They're wanting to speak out, they're wanting to be part of education, and they're wanting to help. For others, there's still that anger, but, it's not a 6-month fix. You don't come forward and say I was abused, and 6 months later we say, well, okay, you are fixed now, so let's move on. This is a very slow process, and one shoe doesn't fit all. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Let's give people the opportunity to survive.
Now tell me this, are vulnerable young women in Yorkshire any safer today than they were before you blew the whistle?
I think a couple of answers I'll give to that. I think we have put things in place. I think, again, there's a lack of funding to expand services and offer more. But also, what we have to remember is this wasn't just young women. There was young boys that were involved in this as well.
Yeah.
And we seem to have, most of the people that we work with at Risky Business were young women. But we did have quite a number of young boys, and we need to remember that this is not, like gender specific, that it is young boys as well. And I will never say that child sexual exploitation is not still happening in Rotherham or anywhere else, because we don't have 2 damning reports and it just stops. So, this is happening, as we speak, across the UK and across other areas in the world as well, not just the UK.
Not just here.
Which is why myself and a member of staff are going on the 9th of June to Nigeria to actually talk about child sexual exploitation and what's happening in Nigeria, and help them raise some awareness and look at what they can put in place and what materials they can develop to actually begin a process of trying to tackle what's going off in that country as well.
And they'll be lucky to have you. I endorse what I said, not endorse what I said earlier on. Of course, the survivors are magnificent people, strong and brave beyond anything I could imagine. But, a lot of people over the years, Jayne, didn't do what you did. Didn't take the risk that you took and turned the other way. So it's not inappropriate to say what I said about you. Tell us about the culture. I mean, when people read your book, I'll tweet a link out to where they can buy your book as well. When people read your book, when they read the newspaper articles, The Guardian about the council apologising to you, and they read this story and they just find it absolutely incredible. They'll wonder about that culture that existed where police could just turn a blind eye to evidence, not to hearsay or complaints or just accusations, but to overwhelming evidence that was there, that you were producing. And survivors, victims, as they were producing. People want to know to this day Why did they ignore it? Why did they bury it, for want of a better word? And has that culture changed?
I answer this, and what I say is I cannot give you a 100% answer to that because nobody's ever told me that. What I can share with you is the reasons during that period that I was actually told why they wouldn't act and do anything. And it was basically that these children were consenting to abuse because they were returning to their abusers, that our information was not evidence, it was only information and intelligence, that these children wouldn't have made good witnesses because they were so angry and frightened. Well, actually, if you were being gang raped and abused, I presume you'll be angry and frightened as well.
Yeah.
So these were lots of reasons why we were given. We were just youth workers. We weren't professionals. Actually, I am a youth worker by background. I'm proud to be a youth worker, and I'm a youth worker with a law degree. But I was always, well, you're just youth workers, you know. And we were given lots of reasons. And here we are now, 4 years on. We've got the IPCC investigations. We've got the National Crime Agency investigate. We've got investigation after investigation, you know. And if there's one thing we need to learn from Rotherham, as you know, statutory organisations, is it doesn't matter who's giving us that information, doesn't matter who's sharing it. Let's look at it. Let's get round a table and let's actually think. Can we get out of the box? Is there a grey area here where we can actually investigate this? Can we speak to this? What can we do? And, you know, to me, that is one thing that I hope, you know, other police forces and the South Yorkshire Police Force now have learned.
You don't have to answer this, of course. And you know, I know you've been asked it 1,000 times, but there are a lot of people who think that there are sinister reasons. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of it, but I've interviewed Maggie Oliver. Maggie's been on the programme. Dave Wedger's been on the programme. I've had other people on the programme connected to or loosely connected to it in terms of had survivors on the programme. And they believe that the police forces, not evil, we're not talking about evil people here, but may have been knocked off the trail, really, of these gangs because ultimately they might have been protecting maybe more well-known or more wealthy or more more prominent individuals maybe further down the line. What do you think when you hear that? You don't have to answer that, of course, by the way.
I will answer. I mean, I suppose if you look on social media, I mean, there is some things, obviously, because they're being investigated at the moment, I can't speak too much about, but, you know, we have got police officers and other officials that are part of investigations into what part they might have played in what happened in Rotherham. So, you know, unfortunately, I can't say too much because there is investigations, but I wouldn't be shocked, you know, or surprised by any of that at all.
Yeah, I mean, Dave Wedger's story is plausible, it's true, horrifying. I mean, the things he was uncovering at care homes, and he was basically threatened. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a second. And thanks for your time, by the way. I know you've had a long old day. I'm hoping you'll stay with us for another 10 or 12 minutes and then we'll let you get back.
No, I'm quite happy to stay with you. That's fine if you want me to carry on.
Cheers, Jayne. Yeah, of course. We're delighted to have you. A lot of tweets coming, a lot of questions. Jayne Senior MBE is our guest this hour. And I'm going to tweet a link out to Jayne's book. I can't recommend it highly enough, folks. I really can't. We're talking, of course, about the exposure of the grooming gangs in Rotherham and the difficulty that Jayne and her colleagues had in getting that into the public domain and getting an investigation of it. I've had a lot of tweets asking the same question. Listeners are absolutely riveted by what you're telling us, Jayne. Was the apology from Rotherham Council, was it sincere, do you believe?
Difficult one to. I never received an apology until it went public that I'd not had an apology, and then I did get an apology. Whether it's sincere or not, I don't know. I don't know.
Fair enough. I mentioned to you today whistleblowers. We have a big problem in this country with protecting whistleblowers, and it's a massive issue, not just in this country, but of course in many other countries. And it seems that as long as I've been making talk programs, Jayne, somebody has come on, not as prominent as yourself, but people who've gotten into trouble because they've raised an issue, maybe industrially, maybe or politically or whatever, and they've suffered. And Jesus, did you get it in the neck when you came forward? What do we need to do in this country to protect people who've got information that's vital?
There needs to be more protection for whistleblowers.
Yeah.
I mean, when I did what I did, it's quite hard to explain this. I didn't do it and think, oh, I'm a whistleblower, I'm going to do this. I did it because I felt it was the right thing to do, and I did it because I just knew I had to because of all the failures, and I told as many people in senior positions that I could, and nobody would listen. So I did that because I believed it was the right thing to do. I never expected the amount of, I can't explain it, Richie, of what came at me from doing that. The intimidation, the investigations that just went on and on and on. And I had no protection at all. And I just think because I worked for a small charity that doesn't have the resources like your local authorities, your police forces, I was kind of left isolated on my own, looking just to my family for support, and it never stopped. And I just felt that it got to the stage where it was more important to investigate the whistleblower to find something criminal rather than it was to actually investigate the adults that raped our children. And I felt like that for such a long time because if it wasn't for Andrew Norfolk, keeping me informed and letting me know what was going on and promising me support from the Times lawyers, I don't know how I'd have continued with this because it just never stopped.
You thought, I suppose, you probably think now, looking back, that you were naive, but of course you weren't. You're a decent, honest, hard-working, law-abiding person in a vocational, very important job. You just think that we're living in a free and open and fair and decent and honest society. So you imagine that when you come out with it, you think, well, finally, I get it into the newspapers. Finally now, somebody will go, right, Jesus, we better do something about this now. We can't have this. We can't have children being exposed. And they don't. It turns around on you. Has that been life-changing? I know that sounds like a stupid question. I should say, has that changed your perception on where you live and the type of society we live in?
I still live in Rotherham. I love Rotherham. I don't ever slate Rotherham at all. I think we've done a massive disservice to all our communities in Rotherham. It's had a massive, life-changing effect on me. It's made me not want to give in. I still have my down days where I get up and think, right, what's the battle today? But I can't walk away from this now. I've stayed in Rotherham. I've stayed in the same job that I was in when I whistle-blew this, on the same salary, doing the same thing, trying to support vulnerable children and working with families, which include parents and survivors of CSE, and that's what I'll continue to do because they deserve some answers, they deserve justice, and wherever they deserve the therapy and support they need to move forward in life. So yeah, it's been difficult. Luckily for me, I've had a very supportive family, very supportive, and some very supportive friends that have kept me going through this, really.
We've had an enormous amount of tweets. Jayne, if you want to find Jayne on Twitter, just go to Jayne Senior MBE, because Jayne's Twitter name is a bit mad. It's Jez.
Oh, my son set me my Twitter up, and he's called me Jess Tia 123 because that would name my first two dogs.
Oh, is it dogs? I was going to suggest it was children.
That? I have no idea.
Yeah, it's at Jess 123 Tia 456. Yeah. But if you look for Jayne,
yeah. Yes. I think he was 13 when he helped me set it up, and that's just a teenager, isn't it? So
there you are. You could always change it, but no, it's good. There's only one Jayne Senior MBE, so if you look for that, you'll find it anyway. The sensitive question, of course, comes up sometimes on this program. It's sensitive in terms of, because whenever you talk about it, you'll get people from a Pakistani background. They'll get in touch with you and they'll be a bit cheesed off. And of course, living in South Manchester, I know a lot of people whose background would be Pakistan, whose ancestors, whose they're third generation Pakistanis. But look, there's undeniably, and Sarah Champion has touched on this, of course, we can't ignore this. I mean, we couldn't ignore it when we discovered it was going on in the Catholic Church. But there's undeniably a problem, not with the entire, of course, Pakistani community, but among some young men, there is a cultural issue with regards to how they see women and white women, and that's very serious. Is that something, Jayne, that you found difficult to talk about? Is it difficult to talk about with people from a Pakistani background? How does that work?
Again, I'll give a few different answers to that. I think that's why we need some research. We need to look at, what is the makeup of street grooming gangs? What is causing people to abuse? Why do people want to abuse? Is it something to do with culture? Is it something to do with religion? Or is it not? We need a really good piece of research that again, is government funded and government led, to look at all of that, because we know there's lots of grooming and abuse on internet, so we need to look at the whole picture to look at that. I personally have only had one incident of a Pakistani male that was very abusive, and actually the defence that I got came from other Pakistani males, because of the things that he were calling me and the things that he was saying to me on social media. I've actually had the opposite, where I have had messages of Pakistani males that have said, what can we do? How can we help? Is there anything we can... So personally, for me, I've not had any hassle except of one particular male in the whole of the 4 years.
That's interesting enough, that is. That's really... You make a very good point too, If some Muslim men, whether they be from Pakistan or whether they be from North Africa or Libya or Syria, if some of them kind of are kind of responding to a more conservative view of Islam, that's something that has to be looked at, and people shouldn't shy away from talking about that. And we shouldn't also get kind of wrapped up in whataboutery, because I'm happy to talk about the abuse committed by Christian conservatives. I'm happy to talk about the abuse committed by white people in the establishment. It's not unique to any community at all, but it's got to be addressed wherever you find it. And if some groups of young men see young white girls who have come from difficult families, if they see them as kind of fallen or tainted, and they see them then as fair game, we shouldn't shy away from that because we're worried about being called racist or bigoted. We should never kind of self-censor like that, But I think you hit the nail on the head there, Sarah.
Yeah, and I think, running alongside that as well, we need some really, really good education for all boys and young men, regardless of what community, what background, what religion, and we need to be starting that early. I mean, the charity that I manage, we worked last year with a group of young men that had been permanently excluded from school for lots of behaviour reasons, and we did some real task-focused youth work with them. And one of the things that I was absolutely shocked and horrified is when we started to talk about relationships, talking about abstinence, saying no, what no means, etc., 5 of these young men had learned everything they knew about sex and relationships from watching pornography.
Right.
So they saw it as the violence, the kind of like forcing people, and it's kind of like, how can we live in a society where we're not actually speaking to young boys really early about respect, about equality?
This is a huge point,
Sarah. Out there for every boy and young man.
This is a massive point, because if I said that I didn't look at pornography when I was a teenager, I'd be a pathological liar. There's a great joke amongst Irish lads. A survey was done that said 70% of all Irishmen looked at porn when they were teenagers. The other 30% are pathological liars. It's a fact. So I would have looked at pornography when I was younger, but it was just plain old pornography. It was just sexual intercourse. Pornography today is viciously violent. I've talked to a wonderful woman called Gail Dines, an English woman who's based at Boston University, who's written books about this. The pornography that's available today on smartphones and on tablets, it's sickening, it's disgusting, and it's torture. And they're seeing this, young kids, aren't they? They're seeing it in droves, right?
And we shouldn't have to wait while young men get to teenagers before we... And I don't mean for 1 minute we should be talking to very young boys about sex. I've never said that, and I've had that misconstrued before. But why are we not beginning really early in with young men to talk about what is a healthy relationship, what's a healthy friendship with a girl, what about equality, and why are we not beginning really early to start to challenge some of them stereotypes? I mean, I've got a young son at 14, and I think that is, how awful must it be to be a raging hormonal 14-year-old boy at this moment in time? How does he show his emotions? How does he cry? How does he get upset? When everything around him is telling him he's got to be tough, he's got to stand up for himself. What are we actually doing to say to young boys, it's all right to cry, it's all right to be a young boy, it's all right to hug your friends, it's all right to feel sad? I don't feel that we're doing any of that at all.
That's a good point, Jayne. It's a really good point, and it's an issue I'm going to be exploring in future programmes. Jayne Senior is our guest, folks. I just want to mention, I've just got one more question, Jayne, again, which you don't have to answer. It's not a silly question, but you don't have to answer it. Broken and Betrayed, the true story of the Rotherham abuse scandal by the woman who fought to expose it. It's available at all good bookshops, online and on the high street. Get a copy of it, folks. We're talking about a genuine whistleblower here, and we're talking about, this is an era where whistleblowers are punished, they're embarrassed, they're silenced or attempted to be silenced. It didn't work in the case of Jayne, but that can't happen. That's got to change that. So you got to support people like Jayne. Do buy that book and read it. And thanks for coming on again, Jayne. I just want to ask you this before we go. Again, you don't have to answer this. Might not be an area that you feel you're maybe versed. I mean, I'm sure you are, but it's up to you. Look, we hear a lot from people on this programme who've lost their children through the family courts. Now, you said earlier on, and I agree with you, there are people and there are instances where children need to be removed from the home. Listen, I could have done with it myself. I survived pretty bad physical abuse, domestic abuse as a boy growing up, and I could have been taken out of that situation, and I would have been all the happier for it. But it seems that, and we hear a lot of stories, there's some really good journalists, Christopher Booker, Sue Reid, writing about this, that a lot of times children are being taken out of the home and put in care or in care homes when they don't need to be, and that might be connected to them becoming prey or vulnerable and becoming I suppose open to being preyed upon by these paedophiles. Do you have a comment on that?
I have two. Am I allowed two comments?
You can say what you want.
Sorry about that, I've got a bit of a dry cough. I think, first of all, if we have got parents that are struggling to parent for all the reasons that you've just mentioned, then should we not be putting some resources and some services in place to support those parents to be good parents? You know what I mean? To do all the things that they maybe never learnt themselves as children in the way that they were parented. So let's put some extra support in, some parenting. You know, we had an extremely successful case a couple of years ago with a young woman who her children were going to be removed. We managed to fight to get a mother and baby placement in a foster family, came on leaps and bounds, taught her to parent, all the skills that she needed, ended up with her own house, 2 years later doing extremely well. So, you know, it can work. But also, I think we need to recognise that when we do remove children, because children are at risk, because parents cannot cope, we need to remember that just because we know a child's at risk doesn't mean that there isn't still a bond and that child doesn't still love the parents, because we know children go through a terrible abuse at home and then will defend the parents left, right and centre. So how do we then work with parents to look at their parenting, to change that, for if they ever go on and have more children, you know, we can't just remove children and then just leave the parent. We've got to do some, because most of the time it's outside factors which make people unable to care for the children.
That's a really good point.
Many parents, some, but not many, are just pure evil. We know some are, but most of them are just struggling. They cannot cope with whatever life's throwing at them.
It's brilliant, Jayne. It's a brilliant sentiment, because why are we not saying to more parents, look, we're going to give you a hand here? And I don't mean a big Orwellian state coming down, telling you what to do. But we're going to say, look, we're going to give you a hand here. There's obviously a few problems. We'll give you a hand, and we'll help you get back on your feet. If it's a case of addiction or, maybe a mental health issue. I get upset when I hear about parents losing their children because the parent has a mental health issue. I think it's a terrible thing. I think there's ways around that. But I know cases are different and circumstances are different.
And sometimes it's naivety. I had a baby at 18. I didn't have a clue.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to do. And the only reason I became a good parent and a really loving parent is because I'd got my family around me. I'd got my sisters, I'd got my dad, that all taught me them skills that actually I'd never learned because I was very young and I was very naive. And what if I'd have been on my own and living on my own? Where would I have turned for support? Because we all know how difficult it is to have a baby that might scream all day.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and I've heard that so many times whenever it's come up about forced adoption and the family courts. I've heard from people who said that very thing. They remembered their, my mother was very young when she had me, and they say the same thing. Jayne, I want to sincerely thank you for coming on, and thank you for doing what you have done and what you continue to do. I think Yorkshire and Rotherham is lucky to have you, and I'm not just blowing smoke at you. I mean that, whether or not I know how modest you are, but I do mean that. Jayne's book is Broken and Betrayed, the true story of the Rotherham abuse scandal by the woman who fought to expose it. MPs have put a question to the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, asking, basically what Jayne has been asking, why has the services not been provided for the victims, the survivors of Rotherham, and why have they been let down? And we're going to follow that with great interest. Great pleasure, Jayne. A real honour to have you on the programme. I really mean that. Thanks for doing what you do, and thanks for coming on.
Right. No, thank you very much, and thank you to your listeners as well.
It was an honour.
Have a good night, everybody. Good evening.
You too, Jayne. Bye for now.
Then. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. The brilliant Jayne Senior. Check out Jayne on Twitter. It's Jayne Senior MBE. Just look for Jayne Senior MBE and follow her there. She tweets regularly and has always got something important to say about these issues.